A dog left behind, a Mustang gone. Alone and heartbroken, Shadow waited near the edge of the ranch. His soft brown eyes scanned the fields where his best friend, Willow, had once stood tall. The loyal dog didn't understand why she had left, but he felt the heavy weight of her absence. Without Willow, the world seemed colder, emptier, and in his heart, he wondered if he'd ever see her again. This is a story of friendship and survival, a story about a Mustang and a dog who shared an unbreakable bond, and how that bond would be tested in ways neither could imagine. The warm breeze swept through the ranch that lay nestled between rolling hills. It was a peaceful place, dotted with grazing animals and lined with wooden fences. Willow, a strong and graceful Mustang, had grown up here. She wasn't like the other horses. She had a fire in her spirit, the kind that couldn't be tamed. Her closest companion wasn't a horse but a dog. Shadow had been just a tiny pup when Willow first saw him. Back then he was clumsy, barely able to keep up with the larger animals. Willow had taken to him right away, nudging him gently with her nose and standing guard when he slept. As Shadow grew, their bond only deepened. The dog would trot happily beside Willow, barking at anything he thought might be a threat. Willow, in turn, treated him like family. If Shadow wandered too close to the fence, she would herd him back with a gentle nudge. Together they were inseparable. Their days were filled with simple joys. Shadow would dart between Willow's legs, daring her to chase him. Willow would huff and toss her mane as if accepting the challenge, galloping after her playful companion. At night, they rested side by side under the stars, their breaths falling into a steady rhythm as they slept. But one day, everything changed. A storm unlike any the ranch had seen swept through the valley. Dark clouds rolled in fast, and the wind howled through the trees. Rain lashed the earth, turning the ground to mud. Animals scattered, braying and barking as they searched for shelter. In the chaos, Willow had been led away by ranch hands. Shadow tried to follow, his paws slipping in the thick mud, but he couldn't keep up. By the time the storm ended, Willow was gone. Shadow waited at the fence line for days, his tail still and his ears drooping. Every time the gate creaked, he would spring to his feet, hoping to see her familiar shape, but she never returned. At first, the ranch hands thought Shadow would move on, like most animals eventually did, but the dog refused. He spent his nights under the open sky, his nose to the ground as he searched for her scent. Each morning he returned to the spot where they used to play, his quiet whines the only sound in the still air. Shadow's grief was deep. He missed the way Willow would lower her head to him, letting him feel her soft mane beneath his paws. He missed the way she would stand between him and danger, her powerful body shielding him. Most of all, he missed her steady presence, the way her strength made him feel safe. But far away, in the wild unknown, Willow was searching too. The ranch hands thought they had lost her to the storm. In truth, she had broken free of her ropes during the chaos. Now, she wandered the wilderness, calling out for the one companion she couldn't forget. Her strong hooves carried her through forests and over hills, but her heart ached for Shadow. Neither knew where the other was, neither knew how far they had to go, but they both felt the same pull, a connection stronger than fear or exhaustion. Back on the ranch, Shadow stood at the fence one last time as the sun dipped low. He let out a quiet whimper, his ears twitching as if listening for her. Deep in his heart, he felt that their story wasn't over. And far away, under the same darkening sky, Willow lifted her head and let out a soft neigh. They were apart now, but the bond they shared would not break so easily. The storm tore through the valley like a living beast, its howls echoing off the hills. Rain poured in sheets, soaking the earth and turning the dirt paths into rivers of mud. Trees bent under the weight of the wind, their branches snapping and flying like arrows. Animals scattered, their cries lost in the chaos. Shadow darted through the rain, his paws sinking into the slick ground with every step. His sharp barks were drowned out by the roar of the storm, but he kept calling for Willow. Lightning lit up the sky, revealing fleeting glimpses of the ranch in disarray. Broken fences, scattered hay, and terrified animals huddling wherever they could find shelter. In the distance, Shadow caught sight of Willow. She was being led toward the barn, her chestnut coat darkened by the rain, her powerful legs straining against the mud. Shadow ran toward her, slipping and stumbling, but refusing to stop. He barked as loudly as he could, hoping she would hear him through the storm. But then the unthinkable happened. A crack of thunder startled the ranch hand leading Willow, causing him to lose his grip on the rope. Willow reared, her eyes wide with fear, and bolted into the open field. The ranch hand shouted after her, but she was already gone, her silhouette fading into the curtain of rain. Shadow froze, his heart pounding as he watched his best friend disappear into the storm. He barked again and again, but Willow didn't come back. For a moment, he stood there, unsure of what to do. Then, with a determined whine, he took off after her. The storm grew worse as Shadow ran, his small frame fighting against the wind. He followed Willow's fading scent as best as he could, weaving through the scattered remains of the ranch. Every so often he would stop and lift his nose to the air, searching for any trace of her. But the rain washed everything away. Suddenly, a rushing sound filled his ears, louder than the storm itself. Shadow skidded to a halt at the edge of a swollen river. The normally calm water was now a raging torrent, carrying broken branches and debris downstream. Shadow's ears pinned back as he scanned the far side of the river, hoping to see Willow. There was no sign of her. A gust of wind nearly knocked him off his paws, and the rain stung his eyes, but Shadow didn't move. He stood at the edge of the river, his fur soaked and his legs trembling, barking into the void. He barked until his throat hurt, until the sound of the water swallowed his cries. Hours later, the storm began to ease. The rain slowed to a steady drizzle, and the wind lost some of its fury. Shadow was still at the riverbank, his paws buried in the mud, his eyes fixed on the water. He hadn't moved since Willow disappeared. His tail, usually wagging with joy, now hung limp behind him. For the first time, Shadow felt truly alone. As the sun began to rise, casting a faint light over the soaked valley, Shadow turned and walked back toward the ranch. His steps were slow, his head hanging low. The once vibrant dog was now a shadow of himself, his energy drained by the storm and his grief. When he reached the ranch, the sight of the broken fences and scattered animals only deepened his sadness. Shadow wandered through the wreckage, his nose brushing the ground in a half-hearted attempt to pick up Willow's scent. But the storm had erased everything. The ranch hands tried to comfort him, offering him scraps of food and warm blankets, but Shadow didn't care. He barely ate, and when night fell, he refused to sleep inside. Instead, he curled up near the spot where he had last seen Willow, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Far away in the wilderness, Willow was searching too. She had run blindly through the storm, her hooves slipping on the wet ground, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Now, as the rain began to fade, she stood alone in an unfamiliar forest, her ears flicking at every sound. She let out a low, mournful neigh, hoping that Shadow would answer. The only response was the distant drip of rain from the leaves. Willow and Shadow were miles apart, but their hearts ached for the same thing. Neither knew where the other was, neither knew how far they had to go. But in the quiet moments after the storm, they both felt the same pull, a connection that no distance could break. Shadow lifted his head and let out a soft, tired bark. Somewhere, far beyond the hills, Willow stopped and listened, as if she could hear him. Their journey had only just begun. The morning sun rose over the ranch, its warmth cutting through the damp chill left behind by the storm. Shadow stood near the broken fence, his nose pressed to the ground. He sniffed along the edges of the field, searching desperately for any trace of Willow. The scent was faint, nearly gone, but it was enough to stir something in him. The ranch hands watched him from a distance, murmuring softly to one another. They had tried to keep him close, offering food and shelter, but Shadow wouldn't stay. His heart was set on finding her. When Shadow reached the edge of the field, he stopped and looked back at the ranch one last time. Then, with a determined bark, he crossed the boundary and disappeared into the wilderness. The open fields soon gave way to dense forests, where towering trees blocked out much of the sunlight. Shadow padded carefully through the underbrush, his ears swiveling at every sound. The ground was soft and damp beneath his paws, and the air was thick with the scents of pine, earth, and distant animals. Hours turned into days as Shadow followed the faint trail. He avoided other creatures, slipping quietly past rustling bushes and distant howls. Hunger gnawed at his belly, but he pressed on, driven by the thought of Willow. Shadow's determination was tested at every turn. The trail led him to rocky terrain where his paws scraped against sharp stones, and steep hills where he had to scramble to keep from sliding back. He paused often, lifting his nose to the wind, hoping for even the faintest whiff of her scent. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Shadow came across a shallow stream. The water sparkled in the fading light, and he stopped to drink, his dry tongue lapping eagerly at the cool liquid. For a moment, he rested, his chest heaving with exhaustion. As he lay near the stream, a memory flashed through his mind, of Willow standing beside him at the ranch, her strong frame shielding him from the rain. She had always been his protector, his guiding force. Now it was his turn to find her. Shadow stood, his legs trembling slightly, and continued on. Far away, Willow was facing her own challenges. She had wandered deep into the wilderness, her hooves sinking into unfamiliar soil. The landscape was vast and unyielding, a maze of towering trees and rocky ridges. Every so often she would stop and lift her head, letting out a soft neigh. The forest seemed to swallow her calls, offering no response. Food was scarce. Willow grazed on whatever patches of grass she could find, but the effort left her weaker with each passing day. Still, she moved forward, her instincts guiding her through the unfamiliar terrain. One night, as the moon cast a silvery glow over the forest, Willow came to a halt. Her ears flicked toward a distant sound, the faint rustling of leaves. She froze, her muscles tense, as the noise grew closer. A pair of glowing eyes appeared in the shadows, followed by the low growl of a predator. A wolf stepped into the clearing, its sleek body moving with quiet confidence. Willow snorted and pawed at the ground, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The wolf held its ground, its gaze locked on her. For a moment, the forest was silent, save for the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, Willow reared up, her powerful hooves striking the air. The wolf hesitated, its growl fading into a low whine. Willow charged, her hooves pounding against the earth. The wolf darted back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Willow stood in the clearing, her sides heaving, her ears flicking at every sound. The encounter had drained what little energy she had left, but it had also reignited her will to keep going. As the first light of dawn broke over the forest, Willow resumed her journey. Meanwhile, Shadow had reached the edge of a vast canyon. The trail he had been following ended abruptly, the ground dropping away into a deep chasm. He barked in frustration, pacing along the edge as he searched for a way across. The sound of rushing water echoed from below, and the faint scent of willow lingered in the air. Shadow sat down, his head drooping, as exhaustion threatened to overtake him. But then, as he lifted his gaze to the other side of the canyon, he thought he saw a flicker of movement, a shape in the distance, too far to make out clearly. His heart leapt. It could be her. Shadow stood and barked, his voice carrying across the chasm. The figure didn't respond, but Shadow's determination burned brighter than ever. He would find a way. Though separated by distance and obstacles, both Willow and Shadow pressed on, their bond pulling them closer with every step. Shadow pressed on through the dense wilderness, his paws aching from the endless journey. The faint scent of willow had faded entirely, but his heart refused to let him stop. Each step carried the weight of his determination, his loyalty driving him forward despite his exhaustion. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. As he wandered deeper into the unknown, Shadow came upon a clearing dotted with broken branches and disturbed earth. His nose twitched, picking up the faintest scent of other animals. He moved cautiously, his ears swiveling as he tried to discern what had passed through. Suddenly, a low growl broke the silence. Shadow froze, his fur bristling as a figure emerged from the underbrush. It was a stray dog, larger than Shadow, with a shaggy coat and piercing yellow eyes. The dog bared its teeth, its posture tense and defensive. Shadow lowered himself to the ground, his tail wagging slightly in a gesture of submission. The other dog eyed him warily, but didn't attack. Slowly, Shadow let out a soft whine, a plea for understanding. The stray relaxed slightly, its growl fading into a curious sniff. It circled Shadow, its nose brushing against his fur as it sized him up. After a tense moment, the stray stepped back and sat down, its head tilted as if asking what Shadow was doing so far from home. Shadow stood and barked softly, his tail wagging a bit more confidently now. He moved a few steps forward, then looked back at the stray, inviting it to follow. The larger dog hesitated, but eventually fell into step beside him. The two traveled together, an unlikely pair bound by necessity. Shadow quickly realized that the stray, whom he began to think of as Hunter, was no ordinary dog. Hunter had a keen sense of the wilderness, leading them to hidden streams and patches of edible plants. Shadow watched and learned, following Hunter's lead as they navigated the rugged terrain. One afternoon, as they rested by a shaded brook, Shadow barked softly, his nose pointing toward a faint mark in the dirt. Hunter sniffed it and growled low, shaking his head. It wasn't Willow's scent. Shadow's tail drooped, but he didn't let the disappointment linger. Hunter nudged him with his nose, and as if to say they couldn't give up yet. Together they resumed their search, each step bringing Shadow closer to the realization that this journey was as much about survival as it was about finding Willow. Far away, Willow stood at the edge of a steep hill, her chestnut coat gleaming in the fading sunlight. Her strong legs carried her carefully down the slope, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Shadow. The forest had been unkind, but she had grown stronger with each passing day. Her search had taken her through endless trees and across treacherous terrain. Along the way, she had avoided predators, found small streams to drink from, and grazed on sparse patches of grass. But no matter how far she traveled, the ache of loneliness followed her. As she paused to rest near a small meadow, a sudden noise caught her attention. Willow's ears swiveled toward the sound. A faint bark carried on the wind. Her heart quickened, and she let out a low whinny, hoping for a reply. The bark came again, louder this time, but it wasn't Shadow's. Willow stepped cautiously into the meadow, her eyes narrowing as she spotted movement in the distance. A pack of stray dogs emerged from the trees, their lean bodies moving with the confidence of predators. Willow tensed, her hooves digging into the soft ground as she prepared to defend herself. The lead dog growled, its eyes locked on her. Willow let out a warning snort, her head held high as she pawed the ground. The dogs circled her, their growls growing louder. Willow stood her ground, her muscles coiled like springs. When the first dog lunged, she reared up, her powerful hooves striking the air. The others hesitated, their confidence faltering in the face of her defiance. One by one, the dogs retreated, their growls fading into the forest. Willow stood in the meadow, her sides heaving as the adrenaline coursed through her. She had faced danger and survived, but the encounter left her shaken. Meanwhile, Shadow and Hunter came across a human campsite, the faint smell of fire lingering in the air. Shadow's heart raced as he sniffed around, picking up traces of horses. His mind filled with hope. Maybe Willow had been here. Hunter growled softly, nudging Shadow to stay cautious. The two dogs moved through the camp quietly, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of life. Shadow's nose led him to a patch of flattened grass where a horse had clearly been tied. His tail wagged briefly before drooping again. The scent wasn't hers. Shadow let out a soft whimper, his hopes dashed once more. But as he looked at Hunter, who stood firm and unshaken, he felt a renewed determination. The search wasn't over. Though their paths were different, both Willow and Shadow moved forward, guided by the unbreakable bond they shared. Miles apart, they each carried the same hope, that someday they would find their way back to one another. Willow's hooves crunched softly on the dry grass as she moved through the open plains, the forest behind her giving way to a new and unfamiliar landscape. The vastness of the land stretched before her, broken only by rolling hills and scattered boulders. For the first time in weeks, she felt the warm sun on her back and the gentle breeze that carried the scent of freedom. But Willow wasn't free, not truly. Her heart remained tethered to Shadow, the loyal companion she had left behind. Every step she took was driven by the hope that she would find him, but the weight of uncertainty bore down on her like a heavy saddle. As she crested a low hill, a distant sound caught her attention. Willow stopped, her ears flicking forward. The sound grew louder, hoofbeats, steady and rhythmic, approaching from the east. Moments later, a herd of wild Mustangs emerged from behind the hill, their powerful bodies moving in perfect harmony. They flowed across the land like a living river, their manes and tails streaming in the wind. Willow stood frozen, her chestnut coat blending with the golden grass as she watched the majestic herd draw closer. The lead stallion, a striking black Mustang with a white blaze down his face, noticed her first. He slowed, his sharp eyes studying her with caution. The rest of the herd followed suit, their movements halting as they turned their attention to the lone horse standing on the hill. Willow felt a flicker of uncertainty. She was no longer part of a herd. Her life on the ranch had been different. Yet, something in the stallion's gaze felt familiar, as if he recognized a kindred spirit in her. The stallion stepped forward, his head held high. He let out a low, rumbling neigh, a sound that carried both warning and invitation. Willow hesitated, her muscles tense as she considered her options. The stallion called out again, softer this time, and took another step closer. The rest of the herd stayed back, their bodies still as they waited for his lead. Willow lowered her head slightly, a gesture of respect, and took a cautious step forward. Joining the herd wasn't easy. The other Mustangs were wary of her, their eyes following her every move. Willow had to prove herself, had to show that she was strong enough to belong. The first challenge came when the herd moved toward a distant watering hole. The land between was harsh, dotted with sharp rocks and steep inclines. Willow followed behind, her legs straining as she kept pace with the group. One of the younger mares, a fiery red Mustang, seemed particularly distrustful. She would often glance back at Willow, her ears pinned back in silent warning. Willow ignored the tension, focusing instead on the lead stallion's steady pace. When the herd finally reached the watering hole, the stallion stopped and turned to face Willow. He let out a low snort, his eyes narrowing, as if issuing a silent challenge. Willow stepped forward, her hooves sinking slightly into the soft earth near the water's edge. The other Mustangs watched as she lowered her head and took a deep drink, the cool water washing away the dust of her journey. The stallion huffed, satisfied, and turned back toward the herd. Over the days that followed, Willow grew stronger. The herd taught her how to find hidden streams and graze on plants she hadn't known were edible. In turn, she showed them the resilience she had developed from her time on the ranch, the ability to navigate fences, dodge predators, and survive on limited resources. But even as she began to find her place among the Mustangs, Willow couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't truly belong. At night, while the herd rested under the stars, she would stand apart, her head lifted toward the horizon. One evening, the red mare approached her, her eyes soft for the first time. She let out a quiet nicker, a sound that seemed to ask a question Willow couldn't answer. Willow stepped closer, her nose brushing against the mare's for a brief moment before she turned away. She couldn't explain it, but she knew her journey wasn't over. The next morning, the herd began to move again, following the stallion's lead across the plains. Willow stayed near the back, her steps slower than usual. When the group stopped to graze near a rocky outcrop, she made her decision. Willow waited until the herd was distracted, their heads down as they fed. Then, with a soft snort, she turned and walked away. The red mare lifted her head, watching as Willow disappeared into the distance. The stallion let out a low call, but Willow didn't look back. Her heart was pulling her in a different direction, a direction where she hoped Shadow might be waiting. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, Willow moved steadily toward the unknown, her spirit unbroken and her determination stronger than ever. Far away, Shadow paused on a narrow trail, his nose lifting to the wind. For a moment, he thought he caught a familiar scent, faint but undeniable. His tail wagged briefly before he pushed forward, his heart pulling him toward a reunion he could almost feel. The bond between them remained unbroken, guiding them both closer to the moment they would meet again. Shadow and Hunter moved cautiously through the dense underbrush as the scent of humans grew stronger. The faint trace of horses lingered in the air, stirring hope in Shadow's chest. His paws padded silently over the dirt as he followed the trail, with Hunter close behind. The campsite lay ahead, the flicker of a fire visible through the gaps in the trees. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, crouching low. Shadow's nose twitched as he tried to pick out Willow's scent from the jumble of smells. There were horses here, he was sure of it, but his heart pounded with uncertainty. The last few trails had led to nothing, but this one felt different. He wanted to believe she was close. Hunter nudged him gently, a reminder to stay focused. Shadow gave a quick wag of his tail and crept forward, his body low to the ground. The camp came into view, a small circle of tents, with a few men sitting around the fire. Several horses were tied to a post nearby, their heads hanging low as they dozed. Shadow's heart raced as he scanned the group, his eyes searching for Willow's familiar shape. A soft bark escaped him before he could stop it. One of the men turned his head sharply, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the edge of the clearing. Shadow froze, his body tensing as he pressed himself against the ground. The man muttered something to the others, but after a moment, he shrugged and returned to the conversation. Shadow let out a slow breath and continued forward. The horses were just a few feet away now, their powerful forms outlined by the flickering firelight. He sniffed the air, his heart sinking as he realized none of them smelled like Willow. A faint whimper escaped him, but he quickly silenced it, unwilling to give up hope. Hunter nudged him again, gesturing toward a small pile of supplies near the horses. Shadow hesitated, then crept closer, his nose brushing against a tattered saddle blanket. The scent was faint but familiar, a trace of the ranch, the life he and Willow had shared. His tail wagged briefly before drooping again. Willow had been near these humans, but she wasn't here now. Suddenly, one of the horses shifted, its hoof scraping against the ground. The sound drew the attention of one of the men, who turned toward the horses and frowned. His gaze swept the area, and Shadow knew they couldn't linger. He gave Hunter a quick glance and darted back toward the trees, his movements swift and silent. Hunter followed, his larger frame moving with surprising grace. The two dogs retreated into the shadows, stopping only when they were certain they were far enough away from the camp. Shadow sat down, his chest heaving as he tried to process the disappointment. He had been so sure this time, so certain the trail would lead him to her. Hunter watched him quietly, his sharp eyes filled with understanding. He stepped closer and nuzzled Shadow's side, a silent gesture of support. Shadow let out a soft whine, leaning into his companion's touch. Despite the setback, he couldn't give up. Willow was out there somewhere, and he had to find her. As they rested in the safety of the forest, Shadow thought about the ranch and the life he and Willow had shared. He remembered her strength, the way she had always protected him, and how she had never given up on anything. That memory reignited his determination. He stood, his tail wagging faintly, and gave Hunter a bark. It wasn't over yet. The two set off again, following the faintest trace of the trail. The forest grew darker as the night deepened, but Shadow's resolve burned brighter than ever. Somewhere, far away, Willow was searching too. And no matter how far he had to go, Shadow was determined to bring her home. Willow stood on the edge of a jagged canyon, the wind tugging at her mane as she gazed at the rushing river far below. The trail she had been following ended abruptly at the sheer drop, and her heart sank. Her instincts had led her here, but now the path forward seemed impossible. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rocky landscape. Her chestnut coat shimmered with sweat as she paced along the edge, her ears flicking in every direction. She let out a low neigh, hoping for a response, but the canyon swallowed the sound. The vast emptiness echoed back at her, deepening her loneliness. She turned away from the edge and began searching for another way down, her steps careful and deliberate. Meanwhile, miles away, Shadow and Hunter stood on a narrow trail overlooking the same canyon. Shadow sniffed the air, his heart leaping, as he caught a faint trace of Willow's scent. It was distant but unmistakable, carried on the wind from the far side of the canyon. His tail wagged frantically as he barked, his voice filled with hope. Hunter barked softly in return, his gaze sweeping the canyon below. The steep walls and rushing water made crossing seem impossible. Shadow barked again, louder this time, as if willing the canyon to shrink. He paced along the edge, his paws scraping against loose stones, his frustration building with every passing moment. Far across the canyon, Willow's ears perked up. She froze, her heart pounding as a distant bark reached her. The sound was faint, almost drowned out by the river's roar, but it was enough. Her head shot up, and she let out a sharp neigh, her voice carrying over the canyon. Shadow stopped in his tracks, his ears straining toward the sound. It was her. He barked wildly, his voice echoing through the canyon, and Hunter joined in, their combined calls reverberating off the rocky walls. For a moment, the canyon felt alive with sound, a bridge of hope spanning the distance between them. Willow neighed again, this time louder, her legs trembling with excitement. She trotted back to the canyon's edge, her eyes scanning the opposite side. She couldn't see them, but she could feel their presence, their voices pulling her forward. Her nostrils flared as she looked for a way to cross, her heart aching with the need to reunite. Shadow paced furiously, his barks turning to whines as he searched for a solution. Hunter nudged him, urging him to stay calm, but Shadow couldn't stop. The scent of Willow was stronger now, her voice a lifeline cutting through his despair. He darted along the trail, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain for any possible way across. Suddenly, Shadow spotted a narrow path leading down into the canyon. It was steep and lined with loose rocks, but it was their only option. He barked at Hunter, his tail wagging as he darted toward the path. Hunter hesitated for a moment, then followed, his larger frame navigating the descent with care. On the opposite side, Willow continued to pace, her hooves kicking up dust as she searched for a similar path. Her heart pounded as she scanned the canyon walls, her ears swiveling toward every sound. Finally, she spotted a faint trail winding its way down to the river. It was narrow and treacherous, but it was her only chance. She moved cautiously, her hooves skidding on loose stones as she descended. The roar of the river grew louder, the sound filling her ears as she reached the canyon floor. The water was wild and unforgiving, its current strong enough to sweep away anything in its path. Willow hesitated, her instincts warning her of the danger, but she couldn't turn back now. On the other side, Shadow and Hunter reached the riverbank. Shadow barked wildly, his voice cutting through the roar of the water. Willow lifted her head, her eyes locking onto the source of the sound. For the first time in what felt like forever, she saw him. Shadow stood on the opposite bank, his fur wet from the mist, his tail wagging furiously. Willow let out a powerful neigh, her voice trembling with relief. Shadow barked again, his entire body vibrating with joy. But between them lay the raging river, a barrier neither could cross easily. They stood on opposite banks, their eyes locked, their bond unbroken. As the sun dipped lower, casting the canyon in shadow, they knew they had reached the final test. The river was fierce, but so was their determination. Together they would find a way. They had come too far to let anything stop them now. Willow stood on the riverbank, her chestnut coat glistening with sweat as she stared across the raging water. Shadow was on the far side, barking with all his might, his voice rising above the roar of the river. For a moment, the distance between them felt insurmountable, but Willow's heart refused to accept defeat. She pawed the ground, her muscles coiling with determination. The river was wild, its current swift and unforgiving, but she couldn't turn back now. Shadow was so close, his wagging tail and eager barks a beacon of hope. She let out a sharp neigh, her voice filled with resolve, and stepped toward the edge of the water. Shadow barked louder, his paws splashing at the river's edge as if urging her to stay put. He could sense the danger, but his eyes were locked on hers, filled with the same determination that burned in her. Beside him, Hunter barked, pacing back and forth as he scanned the river for another way across. Willow hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the icy water. The current tugged at her legs immediately, its strength nearly sweeping her off balance. She steadied herself, her hooves digging into the rocky bottom as she moved deeper. Shadow's barks grew frantic, and she answered with a soft neigh, trying to reassure him. The river grew deeper and faster as Willow pressed on, her powerful legs fighting against the pull of the current. Each step felt heavier than the last, the water rising to her chest and pushing against her with relentless force. But her gaze never wavered from Shadow, who stood at the edge, his eyes wide with worry and hope. Suddenly, a large branch swept past her, its jagged edges catching her side. Willow stumbled, her legs slipping on the slick rocks beneath her. For a terrifying moment, she was nearly swept away. Shadow let out a high-pitched bark, his body trembling as he watched helplessly. But Willow refused to give in. With a powerful push, she regained her footing, her body surging forward through the water. Every muscle burned, but her spirit was unyielding. Finally, her hooves found solid ground as the river began to shallow. She staggered onto the far bank, her chest heaving with exhaustion. Shadow bounded toward her, barking wildly, his tail wagging so hard it seemed it might fall off. Willow let out a soft, tired neigh as Shadow reached her. The dog leaped up, his paws brushing her chest as he barked in joy. He circled her, sniffing every inch of her, as if to make sure she was real. Willow lowered her head and nuzzled him gently, her breath warm against his fur. Hunter joined them, his sharp eyes scanning the area before giving a low bark of approval. The three stood together, the weight of their journey momentarily forgotten in the relief of their reunion. For a while, they rested on the riverbank, the chaos of the river behind them. Shadow curled up beside Willow, his head resting on her leg as he drifted into a peaceful sleep. Hunter lay nearby, his ears twitching as he kept watch. Willow stood tall, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her heart filled with a quiet sense of triumph. When the sun rose the next morning, casting a golden glow over the canyon, the three companions began their journey back home. The path was long and unfamiliar, but this time they faced it together. Shadow trotted beside Willow, his tail wagging with every step. Hunter led the way, his keen instincts guiding them through the wilderness. As they crossed fields and climbed hills, the bond between them grew even stronger. Willow and Shadow had endured loss and separation, but their reunion had reminded them of the power of loyalty and love. When they finally reached the ranch, the familiar sight of the wooden fences and grazing animals brought a sense of peace. Shadow barked joyfully as he bounded through the gates, his tail a blur of motion. Willow followed, her steps steady and confident. The ranch hands rushed to greet them, their astonishment giving way to relief as they realized what had happened. They marveled at Willow's strength and Shadow's determination, their story becoming a symbol of hope and resilience. That evening, as the sun set over the valley, Willow and Shadow stood together under the open sky. The trials they had faced were behind them, but the bond they shared would endure forever. Far off in the distance, the faint sound of a wolf's howl echoed through the night. Willow lifted her head, her ears flicking toward the sound. But she felt no fear, not anymore. She had faced the wild and come out stronger, guided by a bond that nothing could break. Shadow wagged his tail and nuzzled against her, his trust in her as unshakable as her trust in him. Together, they watched the stars emerge, their hearts finally at peace. Their journey had come full circle, and they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side.